So Lonneke and I will give you an introduction on some of the basic concepts in terms of BrainAge. So we also have formulated some learning objectives for you all. So hopefully after the end of both of our talks, which are also connected to each other, you will have an idea about the overall concept of BrainAge as well as its potential clinical relevance. I will mainly talk about how we can use structural MRI for brain age prediction, as well as some of the basic methodological considerations that there are in that sense. Whereas Matthijs later on will also mention the use of ASL for brain age. Yes, let's dive in, I would say. So first of all, I don't think I'll have to talk too long to you all about structural MRI, the different types of sequences, as well as the use that we can have of this. I think also yesterday during one of the talks, Henk-Jan very nicely described how we can actually get from these different types of images by applying different neuroimaging methods to actually have the derived images, so the MRI-derived metrics. So how we can get from the actual images to the Excel sheets with, for example, the volumetrics or cortical thickness. We can also do visual ratings on those images. So there are quite a lot of possibilities in that sense. And if we then look into the concept of brain age prediction itself, the overall concept, like a very rough summary of it, would be that it refers to an individual's estimated age based on many different brain characteristics. So if you look into the example here, the question that we ask to the images basically is, how old is your brain? So in this example, we have two subjects with the chronological age of 70. And if we then look into the predicted brain age, we can see that one subject has a predicted brain age of 60 years old, whereas the other subject has a predicted brain age of 80 years old. And if we then look into the difference between the predicted brain age as well as the chronological age, we get a measure which is also referred to as the brain predicted age differences. Sometimes slightly different terminologies are used for this as well, such as the brain age gap, which is then considered to be a potential marker of brain health as well. So we condense a lot of information from these images, then we predict someone's age using those images, and then we can use this information to obtain a metric that provides a more individual level measure that provides a proxy of brain health in that sense. So this concept actually isn't that new. So if we look into the literature, one of the first papers were already published over a decade ago. But I think there have been certain developments which have led to an increased interest in this concept over the years as well. I would say on one hand, this would be the increased availability of open data. So we have more and more data available that we can use to obtain these types of measures and make the prediction. And on the other hand, we also have developments in machine learning, so the computational power to actually use that data to get to these types of metrics. And here are some papers you could look into as well. They are not very technical, so I think they're quite nice to get an idea on the different concepts. So why is this interest in brain age prediction in particular? So if we look into the research domain, we are using this concept to identify neuroimaging-derived measures for various age-related diseases at an individual level. So the brain predicted age gap has also been related to, for example, neurodegenerative disease or risk of future disease, but Lonneke will tell you all about that in a moment. And if we look into the areas of research, it has been used to understand both normal aging. So it also has been used to address, for example, neurodevelopmental disorders as well as age-related diseases. I think it also has been applied in psychiatric populations now as well. And I would say that the methods development behind brain age prediction in itself also is quite a different area in research now as well. So Lonneke and I will also talk about some of the different models that can be used. So it's good to know as well that that's almost, well, not almost, it is kind of a field on its own now. And the idea is that if we have this individual level derived measures, that we hopefully can use this information to move towards biomarkers that could help for more personalized medicine as well. For example, to be able to detect disease earlier or to inform on certain treatment outcomes, disease prognosis, and also on population-based research, which is my main focus of interest, to see if we can identify factors that contribute to, in late life, have a relatively younger age as well. So I'll now take you through some of the methodological steps that are used to actually get to that single number that we could use potentially as a proxy of brain health. So I'll just outline them now, and then I'll guide you through it step by step, including some of the considerations that there are. So first of all, we use a technique, we use machine learning to make the predictions of chronological age in the context of normal aging individuals. So we train a certain model to be able to do these predictions. Subsequently, we validate this model, so we optimize it, and we also check whether the model is actually predicting and doing what we want it to do. And then once we have successfully trained and validated our model, we can also use it to other populations. So a new sample of unseen individuals, for example, individuals with a certain disease. And then we can perform further statistical analysis to then see how, for example, this brain age gap relates to certain factors or certain diseases and so on. So first, a very quick step back into sort of the world of data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, because I think that these concepts are all used quite a lot intermixed. So to just quickly put it in perspective, if we look into artificial intelligence itself, machine learning would be one of the methods that we could implement to allow our computers to learn patterns from the data without being explicitly programmed. And then deep learning is a specific subset of machine learning that actually uses artificial neural networks. So it's actually based on our brains, the layers, and the nodes and connections itself to be able to provide predictions or to also in itself discover patterns in the data. So looking a bit closer into these differences between machine learning and deep learning as well. So with machine learning, I now refer to traditional machine learning that does not use these complex layers of networks, whereas deep learning is now referred to as that particular technique. So if we quickly look into using these techniques and some of the main differences, one important is that in traditional machine learning, we first have to perform feature extraction. So we have to perform additional analysis that actually lead to one of the Excel sheets that we could then use as an input for our algorithm. Typically, it uses less data than deep learning as well. It takes generally less time to train, and it's a bit more computationally efficient, or it requires less computational power in that sense. Whereas for deep learning, you can use feature extraction, but that is not necessarily needed. Sometimes there are a bit of steps in between, but I'll show to you that later about neuroimaging as well. But it does require more data, and it takes longer to train, which I think also makes sense if you consider that this could actually use the raw images as input as well. And then if we look into some of the applications, so on one hand, machine learning can be used in a supervised setting. So in that case, we know what the actual outcome has to be in terms of training. So we can use the model to either classify something. So is it a car or is it not a car? Is it a cat or is it a dog? And we can also use it for regression purposes. So in terms of the application, that means that we actually predict a continuous variable, such as age. So regression is often the goal as well if we use this in brain age prediction, because age obviously is a continuous variable. I'm just showing it to you so you have a sense of how it's being used as well. There's also an unsupervised learning in which we feed the data to the algorithm, and then it detects the patterns and such by itself. So if we then look into the different steps that we need to get from the actual images towards predicting the chronological age and using that and so on. So first I'll talk a bit about training the model, so step one. So we have our input data, then we have our images, and then depending on whether we would like to use a traditional machine learning model or a deep learning model, that determines sort of the level of processing that we have to do. So if we go from the structural images and we actually want to do the traditional machine learning model, we have to do the pre-processing, the segmentation, and so on, to get to the Excel sheets and to be able to apply it. Whereas for deep learning, it can use the images itself or slices as well. Then looking into some of the considerations, I'm just highlighting it for you so you have a bit of a sense of an idea of some of the terminology that is being used as well. So we have our training sample. So ideally, this would be representative of a lot of different ages, of different sexes, and so on, because you want it to be serving as some sort of normative sample, so to say. And then we can also use different types of MRI modalities. So here I'm using the structural ones, but it is, of course, also possible using other types of images as well. The input data I just addressed. And then there's also the decision on the precise machine learning algorithm that you would like to use. And there are many different things you can do in terms of the training setup as well. So how you validate and optimize the different parameters that are being used to get the most optimal prediction. So the training and validation often is a procedure that goes on concurrently. So what is typically being done if we have the train set is that we apply either a technique called cross-validation, where we have, for example, one part of the sample that is being used for training, like for example, this side of the hull, whereas the other side is then being used to apply it and to optimize the parameters. And the precise procedure that could be used for that really depends as well on what technique you would like to use as well. And then by checking the model performance, we could use that to optimize it again to another held out sample and so on. So we can get to the closest prediction as possible without having the risk of not being able to generalize that well to another sample. So the goal of the cross-validation itself also is to really make sure that it also performs well in unseen data. Because yes, if I have talked to each of you for now and I've asked about your age, it's quite easy for me to make that guess. Whereas if I then talk to others and I have to use that information, it becomes much more complicated. So choosing the right model is quite a balance in itself. There are a lot of available models that have been pre-trained and validated now as well. But I would say one of the main considerations in itself is also what you have available yourself. So what kind of sample, what would it be that you would be interested in, as well as, for example, also your computational resources or the amount of data. So then once the training and validation procedure has completed and I am happy about how my model is performing in my training and validation set, then it becomes more exciting because then I can actually use this model and apply it to a new data set. So as you can see, the slide hasn't changed that much from the slide before, only that now I'm using the test set where I have to also again do my pre-processing steps in a similar way depending on the model that I just used. So again here, it is important to check the model performance and also to make sure that actually the training and the test set does correspond in some features, like the MRI modality that has been used. It's important to also check the age ranges, because you could imagine if the model is only trained on, for example, very old subjects, it becomes quite difficult to then apply this on individuals with very young ages as well. So these are some of the considerations that are there as well. So if we look into the performance of brain age prediction, so how do we know that the model actually performs well? There are a couple of statistical metrics that we could use. I will not go into detail about this, but this is just so you have a resource of just metrics as well. So on one hand, we can look into how well my model actually explains the data. How well does my predicted age actually correlates with my age? And on the other hand, we can also look into the prediction error itself. So there are two measures for that. So we want to keep those as low as possible, the RMSA and the MIA, whereas the measures for the explained variance, we of course would want to have as high as possible. So in these two examples, so I'm now only showing the correlation, but you could see from here as well that here the distance between the actual chronological age is getting a bit higher. So in this example, you would see that these measures would also increase as well, indicating a larger prediction error, whereas here it is a bit more condensed in that sense. And also these metrics are always, there's not like a golden standard for these metrics as well, or like a clear-cut thing that makes you know that it performs well. So it's always important to also look into the data and appreciate the curves in itself, because it's if you have, for example, a much larger sample, you will find that these measures of prediction error become generally smaller as well. So it's always important to look into this data too. So it is also possible to perform brain age prediction in the multimodal sense. However, here I think it is quite a nice example to also see how a model would look like if it doesn't perform that well. So in this particular example, they used either diffusion-weighted images or T2-weighted scans. And if the model was trained on the diffusion-weighted images and then applied on the T2 images, the performance wasn't that well. So the model wasn't able to use the features in a similar way. But if we then combine the models in itself, so if we have more data, we do see the tendency actually that the model performance increases. So this is an example where both the T1 weighted images as well as the T2 weighted images were available. And the ensemble model represents the situation where both were used, so both training and testing. So this data was available in both sets, where you can see that this MIA, so indicating the prediction error, actually becomes smaller, so indicating better performance. However, what is one disadvantage sometimes of using the multimodal procedures, other than you have to have the data available of different modalities, of course, as well, is that sometimes it could also mask out unique associations. So in this example, they looked into different types of models. So either a multimodal model, one that was based on the gray matter only, white matter only, as well as functional connectivity. And what you can see here is that actually the association with the stroke risk only was that pronounced in terms of the white matter-based model. So that is something that also illustrates that it really depends as well on your research question, the data that you have available, and to have a look into this and what the model is built of as well. And yes, with this very quick overview, I would now like to give the floor to Lonneke. After, of course, maybe you have any questions, and then she will guide you through some of the clinical applications and considerations and how it's being used.